Hi guys, it's Mark Zickery of Space Command, also Mark Zickery, Mr. Sci-Fi, and I am back from Comic-Con. It was a triumph, it was a triumph. The Space Command panel, dinner with our investors who flew in from all over the country, gave them Space Command jackets, and then had lunches and breakfasts and dinners with the investors one-on-one and answered questions and told them about the bigger company. We're creating better angels that will be doing features and TV shows and all sorts of stuff. But and then got to the Blade Runner party, got to the Entertainment Weekly party, caught up with Doug Jones, my dear, dear friend and star in Space Command and in Star Trek Discovery, which leads to this Mr. Sci-Fi video, audio, etc. Because I was thinking, because the new Star Trek show, Star Trek Discovery, it was the writing panel and the stars of it, and they're working really hard, and it's a talented cast and talented writers, many of whom have done some very, very good movies and TV shows over the years. But here's what I wanted to talk about, and the subject of today is Klingons are boring, Klingons are boring, and and I'll get into why I think that, and we'll see. But we'll talk about the history of the Klingons, because Klingons in the new show Star Trek Discovery, Klingons are going to be very, very, very centrally featured. I saw the props and costumes on display, the new Klingon costumes, the Star Trek uniforms, the new phaser and communicator and Klingon disruptor and all that stuff. It's a very elaborate, perhaps some might say busy design structure. They're just kind of doing it up to the hilt. It's not exactly the Star Trek aesthetic, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I'm withholding judgment. It actually reminds me much more as a design aesthetic of the the second Pitch Black movie, which was very, very heavy, metallic, ribbed, all that stuff. So okay, but let's get to the subject that we're talking about. So in the new Star Trek series, Star Trek Discovery, it takes place 10 years before the original Star Trek series, and the notion is it's a female first officer. She's on a new ship. She's under a captain who is a little bit complex, let us say, complicated, a flawed human being. Doug Jones plays an alien, and they encounter the Klingons, and of course this is, I guess, the ramp up to the war with the Klingons. And the Klingons look, they're like Klingons. They're you see them in JJ's movie also. They're just kind of belligerent, and they have a warrior culture, and they're like sort of like the Dothraki in Game of Thrones, and it's like, okay, but let me give you the history of the Klingons, and I think they're one of the less interesting aspects of Star Trek, because there's so many wonderful episodes of Star Trek, from City on the Edge of Forever to The Inner Light to Far Beyond the Stars, which I came up with, to the Star Trek New Voyage's World Enough in Time, which I did, which was nominated for the Hugo and the Nebula. And for me, I always found Klingon episodes less interesting, with a few exceptions. And so let's just kind of go into the history of the Klingons. I believe the first time the Klingons appeared in Star Trek, and Klingon, by the way, is not the best name, and originally they were supposedly from the planet Kling, and then someone had the good sense to name it something else, and which was a very good idea. But originally the Klingons were, I believe it was in A Taste for Armageddon, A Taste of Armageddon, which was a first season episode, and this was written and shot during the Vietnam War, and the basic idea was this was a parable about us and the Soviets. And the notion of the episode was, we go to a planet, there's backward-seeming people, and the Klingons want to suppress them, rule them. We're trying to get them to side with the Federation. They're basically a pawn in our game between empires, essentially, and it's basically talking about the Vietnam War and the fact that we were fighting a surrogate war with the Russians in Vietnam, and because we couldn't go toe-to-toe with the Russians, because that would have been nuclear annihilation. So it was an interesting episode in the fact that the Klingons were essentially Russians, and they had slightly darker skin, a little bit olive complexion, and the first actor to play a Klingon was terrific and very, very spirited and a wonderful actor. And the basic notion of that episode was that these seemingly backward people on this planet are actually a very highly evolved alien race, and they aren't going to side with either of us. And they, in fact, set up a situation moving forward where we can't have belligerence against the Klingons or they against us. They will basically be overseeing us. And it was a very interesting idea, the Organians. And it worked. It was a good episode. But the Klingons have always sort of represented the other, the scary, violent other. whether it's the Soviets or black people in certain cases, because more and more African Americans are playing Klingons, and we'll get into that as we continue this conversation. But it's basically the other, and often it's rather superficial, how they treat the other. So they'll come up with sort of like some little cultural things that are kind of goofy, and they'll speak their language, which is kind of very gruff and rough around the edges, like German, and then they'll be violent and unreasoning and quick to be offended and so forth, and so it's not as interesting as the Vulcans. It's not even as interesting, particularly, as the Romulans, and I'm going to get a lot of flack for this. Just my opinion, but that was the first Klingon episode. Then sort of the Klingons became the bad guy in a number of Star Trek episodes, including Day of the Dove, which was, I think, a third season episode that starred Michael and Sarah. And by then they were putting them in very dark makeup. And so again, like, we're sort of almost blackface. And again, I don't mean to cast racial aspersions on Star Trek. Star Trek was very forward-thinking for its time with George Takei and Nichelle Nichols, all of that. So, but you start to say, well, okay, what's the message under all of this? What are they actually suggesting in terms of the other? And again, this was a time of great upheaval in the world, and a lot of insurgencies, a lot of enemies in other countries, etc. So, and the Day of the Dove was again about pacifism and the notion of pacifism, and finding peace between yourself and your enemies. And Michael and Sarah, by the way, the casting of Star Trek, and later these actors played Klingons again in Star Trek: The Next Generation, and Michael Ansara was a wonderful actor. He was starred in the episode Soldier in Outer Limits that Harlan Ellison wrote. He was terrific in that back around 1964, and he also starred in the movie Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, which also cast Barbara Eden, who was his wife during that period, Barbara Eden of I Dream of Jeannie. So Star Trek was casting wonderful actors. But then the next time we saw the Klingons was in Star Trek The Motion Picture, and Mark Leonard played the lead Klingon. And by then they had them look like aliens. They had that rigid, bony forehead. And from then on, Klingons would have that. And then later they kind of gave an explanation of why there were human-looking Klingons and non-human-looking Klingons, or less human-looking Klingons. And so that was the Klingons until we got Star Trek: The Next Generation, and then we have Worf, who was on the Enterprise as a security officer, and he was on our side, but still aggressive, still physically imposing. And by then in Star Trek: The Next Generation, they were sort of space Vikings more than anything else, and because that was a period where the Cold War was cooling down, we were getting. The Berlin Wall was coming down. We were getting glasnost and perestroika and all of that. And this was also reflected in Star Trek VI, where we're trying to make peace with the Klingons, and Kirk represents sort of the old Cold Warrior who doesn't want to make peace. And they were, casting the Klingons again as less violent, more to be reasoned with. And it was kind of a wacky movie, Star Trek VI, but fun. And the Klingons then continued through, Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Voyager, etc. And then we saw them again in JJ's Star Trek, they were going to be in his first Star Trek movie, but that was a scene that was cut out, and then we saw them for the first time in Star Trek Into Darkness, and they were, interesting, imposing looking. But again, there's more and more of a propensity to cast African American actors as Klingons. And it's funny because I was actually talking to an African American recently, and he was talking about, originally on Star Trek, he felt that many of the black actors were represented, were disfigured in some way, and he saw the prosthetics as disfiguring them. And it was only on Deep Space Nine when you had the Captain Sisko, where you suddenly had a black man in a position of power whose face wasn't hidden, like Geordi's visor or Worf's forehead and makeup and so forth. I don't necessarily agree with that view. I think it's a very interesting view, but there is a question of racial politics and social politics within the Klingons, that notion of the other, the enemy. And because Star Trek always had Star Trek is like America in certain ways, because there's the best America, the Statue of Liberty America, that's inclusive, and then there's also the America of the Vietnam War, the America or the Iraq War, or basically the America that is imperialistic, that does kind of go into other places and kick over the system. And so it's funny because whenever in the original Star Trek, whenever they find a planet that's like ruled by a computer or has like a very nice little system going for centuries, they just kind of overthrow it. It's like, it's not our system, so we're going to basically blow up their computer. We'll ask it a question that'll cause it to explode. And So it's very funny because there is that imperialistic, they have the prime directive, but they're always disobeying the prime directive one way or another. So then, of course, and by then, of course, I was working on Star Trek, coming up with First Contact for Star Trek: The Next Generation and Far Beyond the Stars for Deep Space Nine. But again, I wasn't pitching Klingon stories because they were not intrinsically of interest to me, and that could just be me. But the time I actually started dealing with Klingons, which in a way that I found very interesting, was when we did World Enough in Time. It was about Sulu. You can go on to markzicree.com and watch that. As I said, it was nominated for the Hugo and Nebula. Michael Reeves and I wrote it. Michael was an Emmy winner for Batman and the Animated Series. He also wrote Star Trek: The Next Generation. He wrote an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation with Diane Duane, who wrote Star Trek novels. And Michael and I came up with the ultimate Sulu story, and as I said, it was nominated for the Hugo and the Nebula. Now, Sulu was always one of my favorite characters in Star Trek. I thought he was a lot more balanced than Kirk. I mean, Kirk was a womanizer, a narcissist, a grandstander, etc. I mean, all of the worst character traits of Gene Roddenberry found themselves in Kirk, and that made him an interesting character, fascinating character. But Sulu, on the other hand, was a good captain, a good leader, loyal, honorable, athletic, brilliant. He was terrific, and I always felt he was underused in Star Trek. And so I wanted to do the ultimate Sulu episode, which I ended up doing, and I'm very proud of it. You can watch it in its entirety at markzicree.com. And but of course, this led to, when it got so much notice, it was seen by millions of people around the world. J.J. Abrams and Damon Lindelof and Joss Whedon were all fans of that episode, and so CBS wanted to know what we would think of, what our take would be on a Captain Sulu TV show. And I thought that was a great idea. It was a show I wanted to see. Because interestingly enough, when they approached George Takei to be in Star Trek VI, his requirement was, well, I'm no longer just steering the Enterprise. I want to be a captain on my own ship. And that was what he insisted upon. And they said, sure, that sounds great. And so we get to see him as captain of the Excelsior at the beginning of Star Trek VI, and he saves the day at the end and so forth. And he's terrific. And it shows you that possibility. So we, of course, built the Excelsior when we did World Enough in Time. It's a framing story around the story that takes place on the Enterprise. And so Michael Reeves and my friend Winston Engel, who's also a writer, we hunkered down and we came up with the Captain Sulu TV show. And we wrote an entire series Bible, and we wrote a 2-hour outline. And what we posited was that it would take place immediately after Star Trek VI. So the Klingon moon has blown up, the Klingon empire is in disarray. It's basically like the end of the Soviet Union. All these worlds are declaring independence, and so for the first time, Klingon space, the entire area of Klingon space, is open to the Federation, because they need the Federation to help them to keep them going. And we're also brought in to help these fledgling planets who have their own independence movements. And basically, the plot of the Captain Sulu series would have been that the Excelsior is sent to explore Klingon space, the uncharted parts of Klingon space, and encounter new worlds. And it was a whole new part of the galaxy that opens up to us. And our idea was, so it's dealing with Klingons extensively, but on Sulu's crew, as part of this deal with the Klingon Empire, there would be a Klingon science officer. And our idea was that we've only seen the warrior caste, and so of course the warrior caste, like warriors in any culture, like samurai, like Knights Templar or whatever, they're going to be belligerent, they're going to be war-oriented, they're going to be heavily weaponed and trained in fighting skills like Spartans, but there are many other castes in the Klingon society, and the science caste would have been totally different, not belligerent, not warlike. And so the Excelsior, it was Captain Sulu. He was going to have a Klingon science officer. And also, another fun thing about the Captain Sulu series was that in the original script for Star Trek III, when Saavik helps, Spock has been reborn and is rapidly growing up, and he goes through Pon farr, which is the Vulcan mating ritual, or whatever you'd call it. It's like salmon spawning, and Saavik helps him through that when he's sort of a teenager, and then he becomes the full-grown Spock. Well, in the script, she leaves for Vulcan because she's pregnant. Like the movies, she leaves for Vulcan, and they never explain why. At the beginning of Star Trek IV, well, the reason is because she's pregnant with Spock's child, and that was cut from the movie, but was kept in the novelization as a plot point. And so we posited that now it's 20 years later, and Spock's son is grown up, and he's very rebellious. He's like James Dean as a Vulcan. He's the antithesis of the emotionless Vulcan. He's very emotional and very rebellious and brilliant and strong, and he's a blonde-haired Vulcan with pointed ears, of course. And Saavik comes to Captain Sulu because, of course, they're old comrades in arms, and she says, knowing this mission he's embarked upon into Klingon space, she asks if because he's about to be drummed out of Starfleet. He joined Starfleet, but has an authority problem. So she asks Captain Sulu if as a favor he'll take her son on his crew and kind of get him into shape, basically take the rough edges off of him. And so he takes this rebellious but brilliant Vulcan into his crew as a lieutenant. And so it was going to be a very, very, very fun series. As I say, we outlined the entire first 2 hours of it and wrote the entire series Bible. I may well post that on Zikri.com at some point soon. But that was our take on the Klingons and Klingon space and the Klingon. I mean, that's where I would have taken the series immediately after the Star Trek, The Next Generation, and Deep Space Nine and Voyager, because I think that would have been far more interesting than something like Enterprise or potentially even Star Trek Discovery, because it's sort of like, okay, this is, George Takei deserved his own series, and if we weren't in a racist industry where Asian Americans don't get their due, I think he would have gotten his own series. He's a terrific actor, and it would have only been fair. So that's my take on all of that. And I think Asian Americans still get short shrift in American television and American film too. And this is something I very much want to rectify. And I've been casting Asian actors, but I want to do a lot more of that, as well as African American actors, Muslim actors, everything, and LGBTQ, etc. All of that. And getting back to Klingons, so my concern about the new Star Trek show, and again we'll see in September, we'll all know in September, is that Klingons, if you were going to do a new Star Trek series, the challenge always with Star Trek, the great opportunity with Star Trek, is to do a story you've never seen done before that's profoundly meaningful about real life. This is the wonderful opportunity of Star Trek. The challenge with Star Trek, of course, the flip side of that is that there have now been so many hundreds, if not thousands, of Star Trek stories. Certainly if you include the Star Trek comics and the Star Trek novels, which are not canonical but are still stories, there are thousands and thousands of Star Trek stories, and minimally you have to be aware of all of the episodes of the original show, all of the episodes of Next Gen, all the episodes of DS9 and Voyager and Enterprise, and all the movies. And of course, I'm a Star Trek geek, so I do know these things, but you have to be versed in all of it. And the trick then is not to just repeat old ground, but to come up with something new. And when I came up with First Contact, the episode, not the movie, and Far Beyond the Stars, again, it was looking for things they had never done, and I succeeded in doing that. And I've actually written many, many, many Star Trek storylines and pitches that I did over the years, and sometime at some point I'll post more of those. But that was the great opportunity to tell a profoundly meaningful story. And I'm just concerned a bit that by going back to the Klingons, it's sort of like been to the well so many times on that. What new story can you tell about them? How can you have Klingons be something more than just the belligerent other, the they're scary, they're powerful. By the way, the Klingon ship in the original Star Trek series was a really great looking ship. There had never been a ship like that, and one could even argue that in some ways it might even be a cooler ship than the Enterprise. But I remember first seeing that ship as a kid, and just thinking, wow, that really looks great. And the Romulan Warbird was also another beautiful design. I mean, Star Trek, the original Star Trek, the designs were just fabulous. So that's where we all are with the Klingons. So the question, are the Klingons boring? Everyone's going to have a different answer to that one. My answer is, well, yeah, sometimes. I think there have been too many Klingon stories and they didn't really cover enough new ground. And then we didn't even mention B'Elanna Torres on Star Trek Voyager, the wonderful Roxanne Dawson. But she's a wonderful actress, and now she's a director, of course. But again, it's like, well, I don't know. But anyway, that's my thought. So because whenever it'd be like a Klingon episode, it's like, well, I sort of know the bag of tricks. Whereas when it would be many of the other Star Trek stories, it would be, well, okay, here's a chance to see something I haven't seen. So that's just my take, my opinion. But Star Trek Discovery, I think, boy, they're doing everything they can they're putting their hearts and souls into it. I hope it's great. I'm really rooting for it. I don't root for things to fail. Even Valerian, which was a disappointment, I wanted it to be great, and certain parts of it were magical, but just not all of them. And by the way, I just saw Dunkirk. I recommend that. Not science fiction, but It's a really good film, Christopher Nolan. So that's sort of it for now. If you have questions, comments, subscribe to the Mr. Sci-Fi channel on YouTube. You can check out more of my stuff at MrSci-Fi.com. It has links to Space Command and World Enough and Time and all sorts of stuff from my career. So that's it. Talk to you soon. Thanks for everything, guys. Bye.